Howdy! Here is my documentary movie entitled, What the Foresting Forest Are Climate Scientists Thinking? This is part 1, Introduction. We really can solve the carbon dioxide problem, plus a few climate scientist jokes. In this essay, I'm going to talk to you about trees and forest fires and satellites and climate scientists and the scientific method and the bitter truth about the climate change agenda. And yes, I'm even going to throw in a few jokes about climate scientists. That is correct. I will actually make fun of climatologists and risk the wrath of the confused, collusive climate cabal because I'm sick and tired of watching them intentionally fail to solve the carbon dioxide problem that they so passionately and financially pretend that they want to solve. When we are done with this movie, you are going to appreciate that excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is real, it is serious, and it will eventually cause human extinction unless the problem be solved. Also, you're going to know that this problem can in fact be solved by growing trees and sequestering carbon inside wood. You are also going to realize that when it comes to climate change, only colossal fools place all the blame on fossil fuels. Indeed, even if you eliminated all fossil fuels today, that would not solve the problem. There are just too many dead trees in the world, with more and more trees being killed every day. Billions upon billions of tons of dead wood have been releasing billions upon billions of tons of carbon dioxide. Climate scientists know this to be true. They know that the vast majority of the excess carbon dioxide in our atmosphere actually came from the billions upon billions of dead trees that humanity has killed over the last few centuries. But the climate scientists keep quiet because they do not want to solve the carbon dioxide problem. Watch this essay and I'll explain it to you if you might dare to learn the truth. The short answer is that humanity needs to grow 480 billion tons of new wood in order to sequester 768 billion tons of carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. We can accomplish this for a fraction of the money and effort that have already been expended in the name of climate change. I will explain more below, but when you hear climate scientists tell you that growing trees cannot solve the carbon dioxide problem, that is nothing more than agenda-driven drivel from people who want to perpetuate the drama and trauma. I'm going to guess that right now, in the beginning of this documentary movie, some of the people in the climate movement who are listening to what I'm saying are really upset. No, not upset. They are outraged because they can already tell that I'm not going to comport with nor ascribe to the 4-part mantra that has become a religious prayer for the climate movement. And what is this climate incantation that they repeat on an hourly basis? It goes like this. Fossil fuels evil. Planting trees bad. Give us more money. Make humanity sad. I do not even need poetic license to tell you that those 4 points are the foundation of the climate change agenda. The climate movement is sustained by these 4 pillars of their faith. They hate fossil fuels, they hate planting trees, they really, really, really love money, and they relish in a perverse pleasure when they are able to punish people and destroy modernity and send us all back to the Dark Ages. We will talk about this agenda down below. But right now what humanity needs, is for all of you climate people to forget your mantra, suspend your ideology, open your minds, do your own thinking, and help fix the problem. I want to tell you the most important scientific fact in this essay. Are you ready? Here it is. Trees do indeed sequester carbon dioxide when they grow wood. Say it out loud with me. Trees do indeed sequester carbon dioxide when they grow wood. That is the secret of solving the carbon dioxide problem. It means that when you grow enough wood, you will sequester enough carbon dioxide. So, all we have to do is add it up and figure out how many tons of wood humanity needs to grow in order to remove the excess greenhouse gas. And we actually could fix what humanity broke. But right now, those diehard climate people are still outraged, and they are saying to themselves, but we do not want to solve the problem. We just want the climate movement to live forever. And again, I will ask all you climate people to forget your mantra, suspend your ideology, open your minds, do your own thinking, and help fix the problem. Go ask your favorite climate scientists how many tons of wood we need to grow in order to solve the carbon dioxide problem. Of course, they have not and will not give you an answer. But I will give you the answer, and I just did. But I will tell you again. 480 billion tons of new wood would sequester 768 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Can humanity grow that many tons of wood? Definitely. Is there enough land to grow that much wood? Absolutely. Will the climate movement try to stop us from solving the problem? Unfortunately, they will try to stop us, and they already have. And yes, this documentary movie essay polemic is kind of long, but this is all very important. I have several decades of anti-tree propaganda from the climate movement to disabuse. Plus, with all due humility, this essay is more honest, more forthcoming, more geared towards solving the problem than anything else that has ever come from the climate movement. I admit that I have an overriding motive in writing this essay. I want to save Earth, and more specifically, I want to prevent human extinction on Earth. Climate change is not something to mess around with because humanity really could be facing extinction in the near future. I will explain more down below, but I think on our present course, humanity will be cooked in less than 500 generations. I am hoping that humanity will learn to treat Earth like a garden, where we are the gardeners, and our primary obligation is to learn how to control our environment so that we can make Earth more beautiful and more livable for millions of years. In order for humanity to survive, we really need to stop the tree defamation that the climate movement has been sowing over the last few decades. You have probably heard it repeated ad nauseum that trees cannot solve the carbon dioxide problem. But seriously, I am not joking when I tell you this is just false. When we plant enough trees, when we grow enough wood, the carbon dioxide problem will be solved. Also, I admit, I do have a secondary objective. You see, I am so tired of lawyer jokes. Seriously, lawyer jokes are so stupid. I want to replace lawyer jokes with climate scientist jokes. I really want the making fun of climate scientists to become a thing. I believe that all the stuff that climate scientists have done to us, all of us, are way worse than anything lawyers have done. A major part of fixing the carbon dioxide problem should include making jokes about the people who took advantage of the problem for their own benefit. Why do climate scientists refuse to go sailing? Because they cannot walk up to the boat without first arranging for peer review. Why are climate scientists terrible at lovemaking? Because they cannot do it without a consensus. Why are climate scientists so bad at giving interviews? Because their answer to every question is 1.5 degrees Celsius. How do climate scientists change a light bulb? First, they research the problem. Then they arrange a protest. Then they demand that the government do something. And finally, they do nothing because they really do not care about fixing the problem. How long will climate scientists study the problem? Until the money runs out or until we are all dead? My point here is that climate scientists have become a joke, and yet the actual changing of the climate is serious business. And by business, I mean the climate movement is all about the money. This is the part of the story where I want you to assess and analyze the trillions upon trillions of dollars from consumers and corporations and governments that have been spent on the monstrosity of a concept called climate change. As we go through my essay here, I want you to think about all those trillions of dollars that have already been spent. And then I want you to realize that the climate movement wants to keep spending trillions more. And what do we have to show for all that money? Well, we have had 47 years of climate conferences, documentaries, college courses, research projects, alternative energy investments, new power plants, new automobiles, carbon credits, carbon footprints, mental extortion, protests, boycotts, laws, regulations, building codes, jobs packages, donations, taxes, marketing fees, accounting fees, legal fees, judgments, finger pointing, blaming, and shaming. And after 47 years and after trillions of dollars, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has not gone down, but rather it has increased by about 25%. It just becomes more evidence of the insanity of humanity when you try to look at the climate change movement from any type of objective viewpoint. The actual problem that we need to solve is excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is caused by another problem called deforestation. But the vast majority of those trillions upon trillions of dollars that have been spent on climate change have nothing to do with solving either one of those problems. Instead of fixing what humanity has broken, they are playing with other people's money, implementing their social agenda, and increasing their research grants. Assuming the goal might be to solve the actual climate change problems by removing the excess carbon dioxide from our atmosphere and reforesting the forests, then we need to change our strategy and we need to stop wasting money. Instead of wasting money on the climate movement agenda, we can solve the carbon dioxide problem. We really can. We need to hire farmers, plant trees, grow wood, protect the forests. That is the plan. It will solve the problem. We need to grow 480 billion tons of new wood. When we grow enough wood, we will sequester enough carbon dioxide. For those of you with an open mind who want to solve the carbon dioxide problem, please watch this essay and share it with all of your friends who care about Earth. Help convince humanity that we need to grow billions of new trees. And For those of you who have already been brainwashed to hate trees by the agenda-driven propaganda from the trillion-dollar climate movement, you should listen to this essay and try to prove me wrong. Take notes on what I say here, do your own research, learn about the carbon inside the wood of trees, discuss the truth about carbon sequestration with all your climate movement friends. You people who hate trees, and you people who think that trees cannot solve the problem, I want you to take a step back and cool your jets and relax a minute and just think for yourself. Stop blindly listening to what the climate scientists have been telling you and wrap your heads around the simple scientific fact. You cannot grow wood without sequestering carbon dioxide. So, when the problem you are trying to solve is excess carbon dioxide in the air, the obvious answer is to grow more wood. But for those of you who are so mentally deranged that you believe climate change is all just a hoax, I am not sure this movie is going to help you. This movie is not geared toward imbecilic dotards who refuse to admit that a greenhouse gas really can create a greenhouse effect. The fact that the climate movement has taken advantage of the situation in order to pursue their own social agenda does not mean that the dangers of climate change are not real. Excess carbon dioxide will cause human extinction unless the problem be fixed. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has already increased tremendously. The lowest level of our atmosphere, the troposphere, is already expanding at a relatively fast pace. The incremental heating of Earth is real. Global warming is a reality. The slow process of devastating devastation is happening and accelerating right now. And I know there are people out there who are going to say, why should we believe you? And that is the beauty of this essay. You do not have to believe me. Indeed, the scientific method commands you not to believe me. Belief and faith and trust should never be part of science. Science is not a religion. I consider myself an Earth advocate. I am not a climate denier, nor am I anti-science, nor do I work for the trillion-dollar fossil fuels industries, nor do I work for the trillion-dollar climate change movement. I am just a poor, downtrodden, debt-ridden lawyer. This essay is my polemic based on my research and my thinking. It is a roadmap for people to discuss the problem and to do their own thinking and to do their own research and to prove me wrong so that better answers can be provided, or else to prove me correct and implement my suggestions. I am not joking when I tell you to try to prove me wrong. You are not going to hurt my feelings. I have completely lost count of how many judges have told me that I am wrong straight to my face. I can handle it, so go ahead. Do some research, compute some numbers, make real-life observations, conduct experiments, help discover the real truth. But, more importantly, please stop blindly believing whatever the climate scientists tell you. Please do your own thinking. Do not go on faith. You do not need a PhD in climatology to prove that the climate movement agenda is a bunch of hogwash. Never before in human history has it been easier to confirm the factual truth of matters being asserted. So, take out a pencil and a piece of paper and do your own calculations, ask your own questions, embark on your own mission of discovery. That is what science is supposed to be, a quest for the truth for all of us. Science is not supposed to be a bunch of elite and exclusive scientists seeking out their own fame, fortune, research grants, and social agenda. Stop worshiping climate scientists. Start asking real questions about their science. Part 2. How climate scientists became all that. This is the part of my essay where we learn about climate scientists in an attempt to understand what in the foresting forest they are thinking. We have a lot of ground to cover, and explaining the reality of the climate movement agenda is going to be a tough row to hoe. Along the way, I have kernels of knowledge to impart, seeds of wisdom to implant. As explained above, you do not have to believe the story I'm about to tell you. But after you look at the facts for yourself, you are going to agree that this is the only explanation that makes any kind of sense. Several decades ago, climate scientists were essentially, more or less the social outcasts of the scientific world. Back in the day, all the fame, fortune, employment opportunities, party invites, and good loving were going to the popular kids, like the rocket scientists, astrophysicists, geneticists, computer scientists, and the dreaded petroleum engineers. The poor climate scientists had no romantic attraction, and they had absolutely zero horizontal satisfaction. And this really chapped the hides of those climate scientists, all 50 of them, because, arguably speaking, climatology is the most complex and requires the most amount of intelligence as compared to every other branch of science. Despite being the smartest of the smartest, On Friday afternoon, when all the other popular scientists were getting ready to socialize at happy hour, the individual climate scientists were all alone, playing hacky-sack with themselves, solving Rubik's Cubes with one hand, and wishing they had someone, anyone, to catch their frisbees. Then, everything changed in 1979 at the First World Climate Conference. And yes, there really foresting was a climate conference way back in 1979. At this conference, they played a lot of Dungeons & Dragons, they argued about whether Scooby snacks were a metaphor for marijuana, and they tried to figure out how much money it would really cost to build the Bionic Woman. When they finally sat down to business, they all agreed that Earth was facing two major waves of cataclysm that were getting ready to crash upon the beach. And the climate scientists figured out a marketing plan that would allow them to ride the ensuing tsunami so that they would become the rock stars, movie stars, conquerors, and heroes. The first cataclysm was that human beings were killing and not replacing too many trees. Deforestation was a massive problem, and climate scientists knew that there would be massive consequences. The second cataclysm was that human beings were putting entirely too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas which helps to heat up the planet, which generally is a good thing to not freeze to death. However, Earth needs a balance. We do not want to be too cold nor too hot. With too much carbon dioxide in the air, there was the inevitability that there would be too much heat, which would increase global warming, and it would accelerate climate change, and then the remaining glaciers would melt faster, and disease vectors would be altered, and life would become exceedingly difficult for all living things. So, back in 1979, it was openly recognized that there were two major problems: too many dead trees and too much carbon dioxide in the air. Please note that these two problems are seriously real and really serious. They could actually factually become extinction events, and then life on Earth might become death on Earth. Also, these two cataclysmic problems are related and overlapping. You see, the dead trees are the cause of the excess carbon dioxide. This is because the wood inside a tree is about 45% carbon. Human beings, in our finite wisdom, year after year, have killed billions upon billions of the largest trees that ever existed. And we keep on killing billions more trees. What happens to all those dead trees? Well, after the trees are killed, the wood either rots away or burns up, and this causes the carbohydrates inside the wood to become carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The ratio is approximately 1.6 to 1. 1 ton of wood releases about 1.6 tons of carbon dioxide. So, when you kill 1 billion tons of wood, then over time you release about 1.6 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Conversely, when you grow 1 billion tons of wood, you sequester about 1.6 billion tons of carbon dioxide. In order to solve the carbon dioxide problem in the atmosphere, we need to grow approximately 480 billion tons of new wood, which would sequester 768 billion tons of carbon dioxide. We need to grow 48 billion trees with an average dry mass of 10 tons each. We can accomplish this for a small fraction of the money that has already been spent on climate change. Now, for you people out there who have already been brainwashed into believing that trees cannot solve the carbon dioxide problem, I want you to realize that it is not biologically possible to grow 480 billion tons of new wood without absorbing 768 billion tons of carbon dioxide and storing the carbon inside the wood. And while we are at it, planting trees, we really should plant tree crops like pecan, olive, and walnut, because humanity is going to need the extra food someday soon. These three trees, pecan, olive, walnut, grow rather large, they have fairly dense wood, and they make food. I bring up the idea of tree crops because you will actually hear some climate scientists say that we cannot grow trees because we need to save the land for agriculture. But there are numerous tree crops that have delicious food, and they sequester a significant amount of carbon dioxide. Now, climate scientists are highly intelligent. They are really foresting smart. They know all this. They know that tree crops exist. They know that growing billions of tons of new wood would solve the immediate problem of excess carbon dioxide. They have known what the problem was and what the best solution was for decades. But did they admit this? Did they sound the alarm? Did they scream at the top of their lungs that we need to plant billions of new trees so that we can grow billions of tons of new wood? No, they did not. That is because they do not give a forest about solving the problem. Instead, the climate scientists developed a marketing strategy. They advocated research and more research because they wanted research grants and more research grants. They upplayed the negative consequences. They downplayed the obvious solution. They reduced the timeline for when the damage from climate change might occur in order to accelerate the drama. They declared a climate emergency. They became really good at casting blame and shame. They catastrophized the problem into ominous prognostications about global warming and climate change. They could have just called the problem deforestation, or they could have just called the problem excess carbon dioxide. But no, calling it what it is did not fit into their marketing strategy. You see, calling the problem deforestation would have revealed the obvious answer: to plant lots of trees and implement reforestation. Likewise, calling the problem excess carbon dioxide would have revealed that we need to remove the excess carbon dioxide. And the best way to do that, again, would have been to plant lots of trees and implement reforestation. They did not want to solve the problem, so they transmogrified the debate into something bigger and sexier than mere deforestation. It could not be simply a carbon dioxide problem because they needed it to become a moral transgression that would motivate the masses. They created something more alarming and filled with hatred, which would catapult climatology to the upper echelons of popularity. They found their answer, their scapegoat, their ticket to paradise in fossil fuels. Fossil fuels became the common enemy, the windmill that needed to be attacked. The climate scientists created an agenda which included a massive climate movement which would take control of government spending and transform the world energy economy away from fossil fuels. Of course, their agenda also included lots and lots of research grants. Please note that when they held that first climate conference in 1979, the Iranian Revolution had just occurred and the second oil crisis had already started. During that time period, people were sick and tired of being manipulated by oil companies. It is easy to see why the climate movement decided to demonize fossil fuels and ignore the tree solution. In a rational world, this climate movement strategy would have failed. Rational people would have seen through the misdirection, and we would have looked at the facts and realized that dead trees were the problem and growing new trees would be the best solution. A sufficient number of new trees would have been planted. Unfortunately, human beings on Earth are not overly rational, and to make matters worse, we have a whole mess of journalists who have a burning need to distort the truth and exploit anything that can be exploited. The climate movement agenda, with its proclamations and pronouncements of impending doom, dovetailed perfectly into the needs of the journalists to distort and exploit. Solving the carbon dioxide problem and solving the dead tree problem were not part of the climate agenda and were not part of the compulsive desires of the journalists. The climate movement took control over the messaging and the propaganda and the scientific debate and the research grants, and they directed trillions of dollars to be thrown into waging war against the fossil fuels industries. And all along the way, there were eager journalists selling the story. Choosing fossil fuels as the enemy was brilliant marketing, because everyone knows that burning fossil fuels is ugly, disgusting, and unhealthy. Never mind that burning wood is way worse than burning fossil fuels. Never mind that burning natural gas is not nearly as bad as people think. The climate movement convinced us that fossil fuels, all of them, had to forest and go. Now, I do not want you to think that the fossil fuels industries are innocent victims in all of this. It is just a simple fact that all the extracting, transporting, processing, and burning of fossil fuels do indeed introduce massive amounts of pollution into our environment and also into our bodies. The pollution from fossil fuels is dirty, terrible, horrific. And the various fossil fuels companies collectively and or individually have spent an obscene amount of money on misinformation and disinformation and political lobbying campaigns in order to convince as many people as possible that all that pollution from fossil fuels should not be stopped, nor reduced, nor regulated. And they have actively promoted the lie that climate change is a hoax. Please do not feel sorry for the fossil fuels companies. In many respects, they brought the war upon themselves. This war against fossil fuels is slowly progressing, and the climate change movement is gaining ground and winning quite a few battles. People of the world are actually being forced to transition away from fossil fuels. But more importantly for the climate scientists, under the rubric of climate change, they have created a phenomenal jobs package for themselves. Tens of thousands of research grants have been funding tens of thousands of climate scientists who are writing tens of thousands of papers and creating tens of thousands of computer models, all about a known problem with an available solution. Despite decades of research and research and research, there is now 25% more carbon dioxide in our air as compared to 1979. Climate scientists have failed to solve the dead tree problem, failed to solve the carbon dioxide problem, but that is okay with them because they have become so popular that they no longer have to play with their hacky sacks, Rubik's Cubes, and Frisbees on a Friday night. Instead, they're the ones being invited to the exclusive social events. They're the ones being interviewed on television. Indeed, there are thousands of scientists out there from other disciplines who are claiming and pretending to be climate scientists even though they have no formal training in climatology. Finally, after decades of being laughed at as pitiful losers, climate scientists have become veritable sex symbols, and they no longer have to achieve climactic climax all by themselves. Part 3. Orchestrated Tree Defamation and the Climate Agenda. This is the part of my essay where we learn about the artful subterfuge, the shameless legerdemain, and the devious tricks that climate scientists have used to try to convince the world that trees cannot solve the excess carbon dioxide problem. When we are done with this part, you are going to be all, they really did this stuff? And then I'm going to be all, hey, I'm just giving you the highlights. It is actually much worse than all this. Now remember, you do not have to blindly believe what I'm saying here. Do your own reading. Do your own thinking. Figure out how large those large trees really are and how much carbon dioxide must be sequestered in order to grow them. Question: how can you tell when climate scientists are lying? Answer: when they are talking about trees. In order for their agenda to work, the climate movement needed to eliminate trees as the obvious solution to the problem. They could not risk the problem being solved. They had to discourage the planting of trees because once we planted enough trees to sequester the excess carbon dioxide, once the forests were grown back, then the climate movement and its entire agenda and all of the research grants and the restructuring of the world energy economy would simply end. In other words, when your salary and your entire professional career have been dedicated to the climate movement, would you really want to solve the problem? When your primary motivation in life has become an obsessive hatred of fossil fuels, would you really be able to admit that the real driving force behind the excess carbon dioxide has been the maniacal destruction of the forests? It is not just the climate scientists who have a vested interest in not solving the carbon dioxide problem. Big businesses and big governments have made big investments in climate change. Today, there are millions of people, literally millions of them around the world, who have careers created by and dependent upon the climate change movement. The employees of the climate change industries have an economic incentive to deny the fact that trees can solve the carbon dioxide problem. Instead of admitting the tree problem, instead of planting trees to solve the carbon dioxide problem, climate scientists just hide the problem, and they keep playing this game of double talk and double speak, where they pretend that they love trees, and they publicly announce that we must protect trees. But then they turn around and they label trees as sustainable. They proclaim trees to be carbon neutral. They say that trees will not solve the carbon dioxide problem. They publish erroneous studies downplaying the ability of trees to sequester carbon dioxide. They discourage people from planting trees. They encourage people to kill trees and burn the wood for fuel. When you are a climate scientist, you are going to be asked this question: how much carbon dioxide does a tree sequester? The theory behind this question is that it would be nice to know how many trees we need to plant in order to solve the carbon dioxide problem. But the trouble with this question is that trees grow at different rates. They grow in different phases. They have different sizes and different densities. From a scientific perspective, you cannot make a tree-to-tree comparison. Instead, you need to make a mass-to-mass comparison. So, when a climate scientist is asked the question, how much carbon dioxide does a tree sequester? The proper answer to that question should be something like this: the amount of carbon dioxide sequestered by a tree varies widely depending on the volume and density of the wood and the growing cycle of the tree. But for comparison purposes, a tree must sequester approximately 1.6 tons of carbon dioxide for each ton of wood that it grows. This answer equates the amount of the carbon dioxide sequestration to the mass of the wood inside the tree. Unfortunately, that is not the answer that climate scientists give, because that is the type of answer that would convince people to solve the carbon dioxide problem by growing humongous trees with tons and tons of wood. Instead of giving a proper answer that reveals the truth, climate scientists just make up a number, and they use that number to describe all trees. Of course, the number they choose is on the very small end of the scale, because they want to deny that growing trees can solve the problem. For example, the climate scientists will claim that a tree can only absorb 22 kilograms of carbon dioxide per year. That ridiculous number appears in numerous climate studies and papers and articles because the climate scientists want to minimize the carbon sequestration power of trees. But it is a meaningless number when applied to all the tree species. 22 kilograms of carbon dioxide absorbed by a tree translate to about 14 kilograms of wood mass. At that annual rate, it would take 70 years for a tree to grow just 1 ton of wood, which is simply not true. There are thousands of tree species that create their wood mass significantly faster than that. Do climate scientists really believe that a 70-year-old coastal redwood, or southern live oak, or Sitka spruce, or ponderosa pine would have only 1,000 kilograms of total wood mass? Of course not. Remember, climate scientists are really smart people. They know that during their growth spurts, trees can create massive quantities of wood. They know that the suggestion that a tree only absorbs 22 kilograms of carbon dioxide per year is foresting false. But despite knowing the truth about trees, climate scientists routinely publish articles and papers and computer models that downplay the ability of trees to sequester carbon dioxide. Also, when you want to plant trees with the intent of sequestering carbon dioxide, you are not going to be planting the small tree, nor the average tree, nor the slow tree. You are going to be planting superlative trees that become gigantic, or else you're going to be planting trees that have a super fast growth rate because you want to sequester as much carbon dioxide as possible in as little time as possible on as little land as possible. Indeed, whenever you see a climate study that tries to make the claim that trees can only sequester X amount or Y amount of carbon dioxide per year, you know that is a bogus study created for propaganda purposes to further the climate agenda. Every climate scientist knows that there is no average tree nor average year when it comes to growing wood and sequestering carbon dioxide. The only way to make a fair comparison is by analyzing the mass of the wood that the trees grow. Sometimes, when they want to confuse the issue, climate scientists in their studies will make up numbers for the alleged maximum amount of carbon that can be absorbed in a hectare of land. The numbers they invent tend to hover around 200 tons of carbon per hectare. However, this number is vacuously dumb. Out in a real forest, in the real world, where large trees grow, 1 hectare of land can easily store 10 times as much carbon or more. Understating the amount of carbon stored in a hectare of land and understating the amount of carbon dioxide sequestered in wood serve a dual purpose for the climate agenda. First, and more directly, it allows the climate movement to argue that planting trees will not make a difference. Second, on a macro level, it reduces the overall size, extent, and rapidity of Earth's carbon cycle, which allows the climate people to argue that fossil fuels have a larger role to play in the cycle. In other words, they reduce the size of the pie so that the piece with fossil fuels looks larger. Indeed, the carbon accounting procedures created by the climate movement allow the blame for the excess carbon dioxide to be placed on fossil fuels. You play with the numbers, you define trees so that they are not counted, you understate the size of the total carbon cycle, you ignore the carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels that are absorbed, and pretty soon you have a fictional narrative that supports your agenda. In their studies, climate scientists who are fully aware of how many decades it takes for trees to grow big and large will limit their studies to 10 or 20 or 30 years. And in this way, they can pretend that the carbon sequestration inside trees is small and not enough. In other studies, the climate scientists will measure the carbon sequestration of fully grown trees. Of course, once a tree is fully grown and no longer creating wood, the annual amount of carbon sequestration is quite small. The climate scientists will use this small number from fully grown trees and apply it to all trees, even the trees that are actively growing and creating mass quantities of wood. In so doing, the climate scientists can minimize the carbon sequestration inside trees. In some studies, climate scientists will use lumber estimates for the amount of wood in a tree. This trick significantly reduces the numbers because the amount of lumber you can extract from a tree trunk is quite a bit less than the total wood mass of an entire tree. Sometimes, the climate scientists just make up nonsensical results that people just believe because they do not want to be accused of being anti-science. For example, when a climate change study concludes that growing 1 trillion trees would only sequester about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide, you have to ask yourself, how big are those trees? Because when 1 trillion trees sequester only 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide, that means that each tree has a dry mass of 25 kilograms of wood, which is a large indoor bonsai tree. Climate scientists routinely use this trick. They create studies with small trees that downplay the amount of carbon dioxide that trees can absorb. It is high time that climate scientists come clean about the size of their trees in their studies. And all that commotion about needing to grow 1 trillion trees is just a scare tactic. They are trying to overload and disillusion in an attempt to discourage the planting of trees so that the problem is not solved. The climate scientists are trying to make the solution seem impossible. The truth is that we do not need to plant 1 trillion trees. We only need to grow 48 billion trees that have a dry mass of 10 tons of wood each, or we need to grow 4.8 billion trees that have a dry mass of 100 tons of wood each. We need any combination of trees that adds up to 480 billion tons of new wood. If you wanted to plant super fast growing smaller trees or giant bushes, you still would not need to plant 1 trillion of them. This is because generally the type of small tree or large bush that absorbs the most amount of carbon dioxide is also going to be the type of plant that will reproduce quite rapidly. For example, if you wanted to jumpstart the absorption of carbon dioxide while your larger trees were going through their growth process, you could grow salt cedar or Russian olive or the princess tree or the sisu tree. You would only need to plant a few trees per hectare because these trees will reproduce and spread at an accelerated rate. Some people call that invasive, but in truth, these plants are adaptable and successful. Now, of course, the environmentalists will scream and say something like, "Oh no, we cannot plant invasive species." And my first answer to that silly cry would be, wait a minute, I thought we had a climate emergency. Because, when you have an emergency, you are supposed to do emergency things to fix the problem. Then I would reflect a minute and I would say, and besides, those invasive plant species are much safer and easier to control than the hundreds of new nuclear power reactors which are going to start creating nuclear waste in direct response to the climate movement's crusade against fossil fuels. So, here is a solution which would help solve the carbon dioxide problem. For significantly less money than has already been spent on climate change, you could desalinate and pump ocean water into large barren wastelands like the Sahara Desert or Gobi Desert or Texas. And you could grow mass quantities of the smaller, fast-growing species of plants and trees that would survive in a desert environment with enough irrigation. For this purpose, I would recommend the various species of mesquite trees because they can survive harsh conditions. The wood is dense, and when future famines arrive, the mesquite pods can be eaten as food. Your choice, on the one hand, is to irrigate land so that trees can grow, which will solve the problem, or else, on the other hand, you can eliminate fossil fuels and restructure the entire world energy economy, which will not solve the problem. And, speaking of irrigation, let us talk about the foresting selfishness of California. That state has all the water it could possibly need directly to its west. All they need to do is desalinate the water from the Pacific Ocean and pump it to wherever it might be needed. But no, the lazy, selfish Hollywood brats with all their money and legislative power have finagled a way to take more than 4 million acre-feet of Colorado River water per year. That is water that could grow massive amounts of agriculture in Arizona, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Colorado. The best use for the Colorado River would be to allow the states without an ocean to use the river water. California should start being neighborly and start desalinating ocean water for all of its water needs. In order for humanity to survive climate change, we have to stop being selfish like California has been. We have to not follow California's example. Instead of restructuring the world energy supply, we need to fix our water distribution methods so that we can grow billions of trees and solve the carbon dioxide problem. I have been to an island way up in the Arctic Circle called Svalbard. Do you know what I saw on and around that island? I saw polar bears, walruses, blue whales, and narwhals. But do you know what else I saw? I saw a gas station. That is right. Humanity has figured out how to deliver gasoline to a distant island far inside the Arctic Circle. I have never been to Antarctica, but I have read that there are also gasoline fuel depots down there too. Humanity has figured out how to deliver fossil fuels to the farthest reaches of our planet, which means that humanity can most certainly figure out how to deliver sufficient quantities of fresh water to every location on Earth where it might be needed. And it also means that California can figure out how to desalinate enough ocean water so that she can stop taking those millions of acre-feet of the Colorado River water that she does not need. And look, I like California. It has two of the greatest universities in the world right there in the Bay Area. Yosemite is gorgeous, the Central Coastline is stunning, the sunsets on the beach on Coronado Island are harmonizing and peaceful. But California is also a great example of what went wrong with the climate movement. They pretend to be doing something about climate change. They passed stringent regulations against fossil fuels companies. They created detailed and costly climate disclosure laws that all large businesses must navigate. They implemented ridiculously expensive and intricate green building codes. They mandated harsh vehicle emission standards with the intent to eventually ban all internal combustion vehicles. They have forced a restructuring of their power grid, which will eventually eliminate fossil fuels. And on top of all that, California has invested billions upon billions of dollars in various aspects of the climate movement, including research, mitigation, adaptation. But California has failed to protect its forests. The amount of money they spend on tree diseases and forest fire prevention and suppression is minuscule as compared to the money the California people have spent on climate change. Every year, millions of trees die in California forests from diseases and forest fires. But the people of California do not seem to care because they are so focused on waging war against fossil fuels. California has mismanaged its water supply. They could have and should have built enough desalination plants to supply the water for all their cities and all their farms, but they failed. They continue to take the Colorado River water. They ration water to the cities and the farms. They force some farmers to allow their crops to dry up and die. They make it illegal to water your grass lawn at certain times. They have made it a criminal act to violate the confusing and ridiculous water rationing laws. When it does rain, they fail to save all the water, so they just watch the excess water flow to the ocean. With proper water management, California could sustain all of its farms and all of its cities and grow back its forests and have green lawns and trees in every yard. The amount of carbon sequestration inside California would be tremendous. Indeed, there is no legitimate reason why California cannot pump water to the forests in order to help trees grow. I want to see an irrigation line delivering water to every redwood tree that has managed to stay alive thus far. But no, California does not want to help save the redwood trees. Instead, they just want to pass oppressive laws in order to punish people. A rational and proper water strategy would cost a fraction of the amount that California is spending on climate change, and the resulting benefits to the problem of excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would be much greater than the current climate strategy. But California does not want to solve the problem. They have bought into the climate movement agenda. The people there just want to continue fighting fossil fuels. And yes, I know you have been told way too many times that climate change is caused by fossil fuels. But do you think that is true? Or do you think that the fossil fuel story might be agenda-driven science that fits the desired narrative? Have you ever done the math? Have climate scientists ever admitted to you the real numbers? You just need to figure out how many trees die each year, the average mass of each tree, how long humanity has been killing trees in bulk, and how long it takes for the average tree to either rot away or burn. My answer is 112 billion tons of annual emissions of carbon dioxide from dead trees. This is about 3 times the estimated annual emissions from fossil fuels. Yes, that is correct. The carbon dioxide emissions from dead trees vastly exceed the carbon dioxide from fossil fuels. The real cause of the carbon dioxide problem on Earth is the amount of dead trees that are accumulating and burning and rotting year after year. For my numbers, I assume 10 billion dead trees each year for at least the last century, and the average tree has a dry mass of 7 tons, and I assumed 100 years for the average tree to rot or burn. My numbers are rather conservative. I'm trying to present numbers that would be bulletproof from the attacks of the climate people. But in reality, way more than 10 billion trees die each year, and the average tree is way bigger than 7 tons, and humans still burn so much wood for fuel that the average time for a tree to rot away or burn up is way less than 100 years, and we have been killing trees by the billions for much longer than 1 century. Also, the trees that were cut down in the past, over the last century or so, were generally much older and much larger and had sequestered much more carbon dioxide than the trees of today. And look, I said it before, I will say it again. Climate scientists are geniuses. They are not morons. They know that Earth has lost approximately 1 trillion trees, and we keep losing billions more trees each year. They know that all the dead wood is rotting away and burning up and releasing billions upon billions of tons of carbon dioxide. But have you ever seen an accounting from the climate movement that forthrightly acknowledges all those carbon dioxide emissions from all those 1 trillion trees that are missing from Earth's forests? No, of course not. And the reason they are not admitting the obvious truth is because the climate scientists do not want you to know that the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is actually caused by dead trees. The strategy of the climate movement is to place all blame on fossil fuels because their agenda is easier to implement when they have an evil, dirty, common enemy to stir up the emotions and to rile up the people. I'm just going to throw this out there for the sake of argument. If humanity had never started to burn coal and oil, if fossil fuels had never been used, then our species would have kept on burning wood as the primary fuel source, and right now there would be no forest left, and we would be in a world of hurt. Truth be told, fossil fuels have saved us from ourselves. Being honest about fossil fuels is not part of the climate agenda, Instead of solving the carbon dioxide problem by growing more trees, the climate movement makes up excuse after excuse to discourage the planting of trees. Every few months, you can find yet another study that claims to have proved that there is not enough land to plant trees. But this is just false. There is plenty of land to plant billions upon billions of trees. We know this is true because humanity was the species that cut down the billions upon billions of trees that used to be there and now are gone. The climate people also say that trees produce volatile organic compounds, which is a doltish excuse because that is just a natural part of life and living. Indeed, right now, at this very instant, somewhere in the world, there are climate scientists who are eating, drinking, smoking, toking, urinating, defecating, belching, and farting out volatile organic compounds. For another excuse, they say that we should not plant trees because the trees will die when they are not planted correctly and or managed properly, which is just pointing out the obvious. The solution is to hire farmers to plant the trees and grow them. Seriously, as a society, would you rather employ tens of thousands of climate scientists studying the problem or tens of thousands of farmers solving the problem? Climate scientists also just make up false claims about the inability of trees to sequester enough carbon dioxide. But, as explained above, a tree will sequester about 1.6 tons of carbon dioxide to grow 1 ton of wood. It is just a simple fact of science that when you grow enough tons of wood, you will sequester enough tons of carbon dioxide. For still another excuse, some of the climate people will come right out and admit that we must not grow trees to sequester carbon dioxide because it would detract from the agenda and it would allow the fossil fuels companies to get away with it. This sounds like cutting off your nose to spite your face, only in this case it is more like condemning humanity to extinction in order to promote your agenda. Another thing that they do when they're trying to minimize the amount of carbon dioxide sequestration inside trees is to forget to include the carbon inside the soil of a forest. What happens is that the trees in the forest will drop their leaves and needles and sap and twigs and bark and nuts and cones and fruit. Over time, the tree droppings will decompose, but there is a time lag of a few years, and the tree droppings on the soil of a forest are constantly replenished. So this allows the forest soil to accumulate and to become a carbon sink. When you sequester 768 billion tons of carbon dioxide inside the wood of 48 billion trees, you are also going to have about 200 billion tons of carbon dioxide sequestered inside the forest soil. But the climate people in their tree sequestration studies do not admit that there is a massive amount of carbon inside the forest soil when they argue that trees cannot solve the problem. The latest excuse that the climate people give for not planting trees is called albedo, which is just a fancy word for light reflection. In a nutshell, the albedo tree theory alleges that planting trees will cause global warming. Trees are green, which green color is often darker than the rocks and dirt and snow that can be found on empty land. So, the theory is that treeless land would reflect the sunlight and be cooler, but the land with green trees would absorb the sunlight, which would turn into heat and cause global warming. This albedo tree theory is mother foresting false, stupid, and ass backward. It is simply not true that something green is automatically going to absorb more light and produce more heat and have a higher temperature than something else that is white. This is why on a hot summer day in the desert of Arizona, you can safely walk barefoot across a field of dark green grass, but highly reflective, bright white concrete will burn your bare feet. And according to this albedo theory, bright white ice and snow with a very high albedo number should absorb very little heat, but this is just plain not true. Ice and snow are actually very good at absorbing the heat from infrared light, and the infrared bands of light deliver more heat than any other color. And just about every part of a tree has a high specific heat capacity, which means that it takes quite a lot of energy to raise the temperature of a tree. Plus, trees have relatively low thermal conductivity, which means that the heat that is absorbed by a tree is not released at a fast rate. Also, the leaves and needles of trees are pretty good at reflecting infrared light. Further, a fairly significant portion of the light energy from the sun that trees do absorb is transformed into chemical energy called sugar. What this means is that trees are not heat producers, but rather they are heat reflectors and heat insulators. If you were to read the albedo studies, you would find that climate scientists use computer models and satellite data, and they routinely exclude and or ignore things like specific heat and complex thermodynamics analysis and the mid and far infrared light bands and even thermometers. Why do they do that? Well, obviously, they do not want to leave their offices and travel to a real forest because they do not want real facts and real observations to mess up their predetermined conclusions. But You really do not need a satellite study to observe and feel the truth about trees. You can walk into any forest and you can immediately feel that the temperature is cooler. This is because trees reflect the infrared light and they insulate the ground from the heat of the sun. A few hundred years ago, Earth had significantly more trees and more forests. Indeed, Earth has lost about 1/3 of her forests. If the albedo tree theory, as explained by climate scientists, had any validity whatsoever, then the elimination of all those trees would have caused a massive amount of global cooling. According to the albedo theory, by killing off 1/3 of the forests, we should be absorbing less heat and we should be cooler today without all those dark green trees. But this is not happening. Instead, we keep cutting down trees and Earth keeps getting hotter and hotter. We keep marching down the path of self-destruction. And speaking of wackadoodle satellite studies performed by climate scientists, there is a new satellite that was recently launched after years of effort costing hundreds of millions of dollars that is supposed to help measure the biomass of all the trees still remaining on Earth. The theory appears to be that if only we could have a more accurate accounting of the total mass of all the trees in the world, we would have a better understanding of the carbon sequestration of trees. My question is, why? Why does humanity need to spend all that money to count a portion of the mass of every tree by a satellite? We already have machines that can measure atmospheric carbon dioxide. We already know that there is too much carbon dioxide in the air. We know that trees take carbon dioxide out of the air and make wood. Why do we need an expensive satellite study that is going to count the number of angels dancing on the head of a pin? Instead of expensive satellite studies, we just need to plant more trees and grow more wood until the carbon dioxide levels return to an acceptable level. All that money wasted on the satellite study would have been better spent on planting new trees that Earth so desperately needs. My best guess is that the real intent of the biomass super radar satellite is to provide some numbers, however erroneous those numbers might be, in order to help create a lucrative carbon credit marketplace. Part 4. Scientific method desecrated by the climate movement. Climate scientists have become too overly concerned about their jobs and their research projects and the approval of their peers and the number of times their own writings are cited in other writings and building a consensus and social activism. They want to be popular. They want to be loved. They do not give a foresting damn about solving the carbon dioxide problem. And that explains why climate scientists have lost focus of the scientific method. Seriously, you do not need 14,000 climate scientists signing the same letter. You do not need multiple climate conferences year after year to prove there's too much carbon dioxide in the air. The very idea that a consensus could prove the truth of an assertion is, and always has been, a logical fallacy. Science is not a democracy. The majority does not rule. Science is supposed to be governed by evidence and facts and experiments and real-world observations. Climate scientists have become agents of their financial agenda instead of being truth seekers. The last climate conference proceedings went something like this. Talk about money, argue about money, vote on money, adjourn. Open and critical and comprehensive peer review has been abandoned. Anyone failing to align with the official dogma of the climate movement runs the risk of being ignored, shunned, ostracized, or worst of all, blacklisted from future research grants. They put pressure on social media companies to monitor content so that the accepted consensus of the climate movement can be promoted. There are climate change foundations that write and distribute climate change promotional articles so that the news media can publish the climate agenda. And this is the frame of mind that allows climate scientists to ignore the actual problem and to focus on their social agenda and to spend too much money on irrelevant research and to adopt bogus theories like albedo in order to discourage the planting of beautiful, gorgeous, wonderful trees. Climate scientists, because of your advocating that there might be such a thing as a consensus in the scientific method, and you're blackballing scientists who might have a difference of opinion, and your blurring of the line between academic research and political advocacy, and your lust for money, and your deceptive perpetuation of the carbon dioxide problem, you should hang your heads in shame, and you should be forever banned from Dungeons and Dragons. If you climate scientists were being forthright, you would readily admit that the accumulated carbon dioxide emissions from the 10 billion trees that die each year, year after year, vastly exceed the carbon dioxide emitted by the burning of fossil fuels. You would admit that you intentionally rigged the carbon dioxide accounting procedures to hide the fact that dead trees are the real source of the carbon dioxide problem in the atmosphere. And once the truth be admitted, the problem is going to be solved. Admittedly, and that means I'm going to admit something, so please pay attention, There are brilliant climate scientists out there right now doing excellent research on complicated things like dynamic meteorology and paleoclimatology and cloud physics and numerous other subspecialties of climate science. And I am not suggesting that all of them are doing bad work, nor am I suggesting that there is anything wrong with trying to discover new things. Indeed, I love reading and learning about climate patterns from millions of years ago that were discovered by ridiculously talented and hyper-intelligent scientists who had to piece together millions of data points. I do my best to understand it all. It is not easy, but I try. I am sure that all the climate scientists who are winning all those research grants are performing the research exactly as disclosed in a skillful and professional manner. What I'm saying here is that I want you climate scientists to step back and survey the landscape and stop focusing on your research grants for long enough to see the entire forest. Because all the climate work you are doing and all the funding you are fighting for would not be available if it were not for the climate movement doing a masterful job of manipulating the realities and the priorities and the anxieties of the people of the world. You climate scientists, you should ask yourself two questions. 1. Will the research I'm doing remove the excess carbon dioxide from the air? 2. Will the research I'm doing create a new forest or grow back an old forest? I'm guessing that the vast majority of you climate scientists would have to answer both questions in the negative. And that is because you are not focused on solving the two actual problems. And I know you climate scientists are going to respond and say something like, but climate change is really serious and it will cause cataclysmic catastrophes and catastrophic cataclysms. And I will agree with you. Climate change is really serious. I already admitted that point up above, which is why humanity needs to take all those trillions of dollars being thrown into the holy crusade of climate change and use that money to hire farmers and grow billions of new trees and reforest the deforest. When you have a climate emergency, which you climate scientists have already declared, you need to stop all your esoteric research and stop your social agenda and stop trying to restructure the world energy economy and start solving the problem by planting trees and sequestering the excess carbon dioxide. And yes, I completely understand that when you climate scientists stand up and speak the truth, you might end up being shunned or ostracized or blackballed. But please ask yourself, do you really want to be part of the climate agenda? Or do you want to be part of the climate solution? And speaking of the solution, let us look at history. I'm going to call it the paleoclimatological, historical, truthical solution. 20,000 years ago, the northern portions of North America, Europe, and Asia were covered by glaciers. Then over time, Earth went into a warming trend and the glaciers started to melt. Please note that the vast majority of the glaciers had already melted thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution. Or in other words, humanity cannot be blamed for any melting of the glaciers that occurred before we had any semblance of a civilized civilization. Also, please note that we are still living through this warming trend. In fact, without human interference, this warming trend will keep trending for another 10,000 years or so. When all those glaciers melted during this warming trend, there was a tremendous amount of water that was released. Because of all this melted water, the sea level rose over 100 meters. Go to your favorite beach today and stand on the sand and just imagine that 20,000 years ago, your favorite beach, the place where you are standing, used to be more than 100 meters above sea level. You should take note that the rise of the sea level by over 100 meters occurred thousands of years before the existence of the fossil fuels industries. Humanity cannot be blamed for this rise in the sea level. The historic melting of the glaciers and the rise of the sea level should be included with and analyzed with any scientific discussion of climate change. But this is not happening. Instead, the climate movement likes to begin the analysis at some time, at some undefined year, near the start of the Industrial Revolution. They pretend that the long-term warming trend is irrelevant, and they just ignore all those massive glaciers that had already melted thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution. And then they place all the blame for climate change on fossil fuels. After the glaciers melted and the sea level rose, there were vast areas of land in North America, Europe, and Asia that were finally exposed to sunlight for the first time in thousands of years. What happened next? That is right, Earth grew billions upon billions of trees where those glaciers used to be. Because Earth knew that she needed forests. She needed insulation from the sunlight, and she needed to be able to control carbon dioxide. Trees were her answer. Trees were Earth's solution to controlling her climate. Trees are perfectly designed living miracles that would and could control global warming if only humanity would stop killing them and start growing more of them. Once you plant trees in bulk and help them grow, trees become self-replicating, climate-stabilizing warriors needing very little maintenance. Trees are amazingly beautiful and amazingly useful. We should be growing new trees by the billions. How difficult would it be to copy what Earth had already successfully accomplished? Grow trees, solve the problem. But solving the problem and reaching symmetry and helping human beings survive on Earth for the next few millions of years are not what the climate movement seeks. Instead, they tell us that trees are sustainable and carbon neutral, and they say that it is okay to burn wood. I once had a conversation with a climate scientist from one of those elite East Coast universities, and I explained my analysis that excess carbon dioxide was in fact caused by dead trees, and that we could sequester the excess carbon dioxide by planting and growing a few billion large trees. The climate scientist responded and told me that my analysis was irrelevant because the consensus of scientists had already focused on fossil fuels and they had already decided the issue and nothing could change that. Or in other words, the climate scientist was saying that truth did not matter, the agenda was set, and that solving the problem was not important. I should point out that trees do this thing called transpiration, whereby the stored water inside a tree is released over time in the form of water vapor, and this dissipates heat. The massive amount of trees in a forest can actually contribute to cloud formation, and the clouds bring more rain, which allows more trees to grow. Plus, clouds block infrared light from reaching the ground, which helps to keep Earth cooler. But the climate movement ignores things like tree transpiration when they're trying to discourage the planting of trees. Even if we eliminated all fossil fuels today, we would still have those billions of dead trees releasing billions of tons of carbon dioxide. And right now there are about 2 billion people whose primary fuel source is the burning of wood. The elimination of fossil fuels would accelerate the destruction of the forest because more people would start burning more wood, which would send more carbon dioxide into the air at a faster pace. And look, nobody is going to seriously deny the fact that the burning of fossil fuels has indeed been disgusting and unhealthy. We need to increase the efficiency of and reduce the pollution from fossil fuels until we can find viable and safe alternatives that will support the future population of human beings. But when are the climate scientists going to follow the scientific method and admit the truth about too many dead trees causing the excess carbon dioxide and admit that the burning of wood is equally disgusting and equally unhealthy as fossil fuels? In fact, burning wood is less efficient and produces more carbon dioxide emissions. Yet for some crazy reason, fossil fuels have become the enemy and the burning of wood is encouraged. When you question the climate dogma, climate scientists will start to whine and complain and cry out loud, "You do not believe in science." But they have it backwards and upside down. The climate scientists are the ones who have refused to use science as a fact-finding tool to discover the truth. And instead they have decided to engage in the pursuit of money, political influence, fame, blaming, and shaming. Indeed, we are not supposed to believe in science. The scientific method commands us to analyze the evidence and question and investigate all relevant facts. The scientific method always asks for more proof, and it is never satisfied with mere belief, nor conjecture, nor consensus. That is what science is all about, the honest and never-ending quest for more knowledge, coupled with the ever-present responsibility to explain to humanity what it all really means. The climate movement has desecrated the scientific method by stifling dissent, punishing dissenters, lusting after money, and pursuing their social agenda. So, under the scientific method, under the peer review process, and with respect to those studies about trees and climate change, here are some questions that you climate scientists should be asking. What species of trees are they talking about in those studies? What would be the mass of those trees? If they use large trees in the studies, the kinds of trees that you would find in a forest, instead of bonsai trees, would that not change all of the conclusions? Why do they ignore the fruit, leaves, and roots of trees when they measure carbon capture? Why do they ignore infrared light, specific heat, and thermal conductivity in those albedo studies? You climate scientists are beyond wicked smart. You know what questions to ask. Please start asking. Lastly, on this point, you climate scientists should wrap your heads around the fact that trillions upon trillions of dollars have been wasted on chasing after the climate agenda instead of solving the carbon dioxide problem, all because you desecrated science. Real people have had to pay an obscene amount of real money because you have decided to engage in social engineering. And yet, all the while, the actual carbon dioxide problem has become tremendously worse. Part 5. Consequences, predictions, and our climactic climate future. I believe that climate change is not just about ice melting and oceans rising and Florida being submerged underwater. It is actually much more serious. Climate change has the potential to become a human extinction event. To be technical, it is not just the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is going to burn us up and kill us. The root of the problem is that the northern hemisphere on Earth has approximately twice as much land as the southern hemisphere. And Earth's orbit around the sun has cycles and variations that cause long periods of time where the northern hemisphere receives more sunlight. Earth's orbit around the sun is elliptical and not a circle, and it can have small changes over time. Plus, the angle of Earth's tilt affects the amount of sunlight, and there is also a wobble precession thing to cycle through. So, Earth revolves, rotates, wobbles, and tilts its way through the universe. This is why we have ice ages lasting tens of thousands of years, and why we have warming trends where ice melts for tens of thousands of years. Without human interference, Earth will balance herself, and the long warming trends and ice ages will continue. But when you are on the warm side of a warming trend, which we are, the extra heat from excess carbon dioxide will push us over the edge. On the current cycle, with all that excess carbon dioxide in the air, with all that forest land that we destroyed, the long warming trend that we are experiencing on Earth right now will keep going. It will not end. It will not swing back into a cooling trend. The glaciers will not return. Over the next 12,000 years, Earth will just become hotter and hotter. Our world will turn into a frying pan. The livestock will die, the crops will fail, diseases will become rampant, and eventually humanity will be cooked to a crisp. And, as I explained above, this is why Earth was smart enough to grow billions of trees when all those glaciers melted in the northern hemisphere. She was trying to insulate herself from the sunlight. She was trying to mitigate the warming trend so that in the future, an ice age would return. Predicting the future is difficult. You never know when the warmer temperatures might cause the mutation of a killer virus to wipe us all out. Or, at any time there could be a supermassive solar flare that might roast us out of existence. Or, a space rock the size of Arizona might smash into California, killing everything on the planet. On the other hand, you never know when human ingenuity might invent the things that will save us from any future harm. But I think the overwhelming odds are that leaving excess carbon dioxide in our atmosphere will create a convection oven, and eventually the heat will terminate us. Personally, I am not satisfied with the proposition that humanity might be extinct in a few thousand years. I want humanity to survive for forever. It actually makes me happy to think that millions of years in the future, humanity will be traveling the galaxy, populating planets along the way. But that is not going to happen unless we might learn how to control the greenhouse gases and control our climate. Also, I need to explain that fixing the carbon dioxide problem by removing enough carbon dioxide from the air so that it returns to acceptable levels does not mean that we can prevent all the damage from climate change. When I say we need to fix the problem, I'm talking about preventing human extinction. I'm talking about removing the excess carbon dioxide from our atmosphere so that Earth can continue going through her long cycles of warming trends and cooling trends. However, I do not think it is possible to save Florida from being submerged. Indeed, I think anyone who believes that the famous 1.5 degrees Celsius thing is going to save Florida should be deemed a climate denier. No matter what we might do now, there are massive glaciers that will be melting, and there will be significant changes to Earth's sea level and climate. We are just going to have to learn how to adapt. But removing the excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere would slow down the warming. It would delay the rise of the sea level, and it would grant to humanity extra time to prepare and the chance to survive as a species. Remember up above when I told you that over the last 20,000 years or so, the sea level has risen over 100 meters. Well, here is the scary part of that. Approximately 99.9% of all that rise in the sea level occurred when the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were in the good range. What this means is that even after we remove the excess carbon dioxide, the current warming trend will still continue and there will still be climate change. However, by removing the excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we increase the odds that humanity will survive. We increase the odds that another ice age will return. And that is another thing that is so irritating about climate scientists. They know that the current warming trend is natural and real. They know how much glacial ice melted over the last 20,000 years. They know that this natural warming trend is going to keep going and it is going to keep melting more and more glaciers. They know that Florida is a goner. They know that the low-lying coastal areas and islands will disappear beneath the waves. If climate scientists were being honest and were admitting the truth, they would tell us that Earth, as we know it, is going to be going through massive changes, and Earth will suffer heartbreaking devastations. But by working together, humanity can regrow the forests and remove the excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that will give us the best chance to survive. When it comes to climate change, humanity's goal should be the avoidance of extinction. Instead of open candor and steadfast veracity, the climate movement has invented a deceptive scenario where they have falsely convinced the people of the world that if only we could keep the global temperatures rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and if only we could eliminate fossil fuels, and if only people would believe in science and keep funding climate research, then everything will be okay. This agenda from the climate movement is not scientific truth, but rather it is an opportunistic marketing plan. It is a material misrepresentation of humanity's future. I have no idea how climate scientists can sleep at night. And speaking of consequences, if all those climatologists and environmentalists and sustainability experts were sincere and really cared about controlling the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then they would be leading the charge to put out each and every forest fire as quickly as possible when the fires are still small. Forest fires are monstrously bad for 3 reasons. The fire itself emits carbon dioxide. The fire kills the trees, and that stops the trees from absorbing and storing any more carbon dioxide. And the dead trees just stand out there in the forest, slowly rotting away, which emits still more carbon dioxide into the air. Year in and year out, fires burn millions of hectares of forest land around the world. To save humanity, we need to stop those fires immediately and protect the trees. The fact that all those climate scientists are not trying desperately to put out forest fires immediately as soon as the fires start just goes to show that they have another agenda other than controlling the carbon dioxide. If they cared about the forests and the trees, we would already have an entire air force of firefighting drones to combat forest fires. We have the technology to launch drones halfway across the world, and with pinpoint accuracy, we can blow up a school or a milk factory. So we definitely have the technology to stop a forest fire within minutes of it starting. Those alleged environmentalists and forestry experts must stop pretending that forest fires are a good thing. There is nothing good about a major fire in the forest where millions upon millions of trees and plants and mammals and birds and reptiles and insects are all killed. The pyromaniacal theory that forest fires are good for the forest is just sick and wrong. There are much better ways to manage a forest that do not include killing millions of plants and animals. We need to start taking care of the Garden of Earth. Instead of pretending that forest fires are beneficial, we need to stop the forest fires, all of them. Seriously, we need to build a fleet of firefighting drone planes, and we need to put out all forest fires as soon as they start. Part 6. Conclusion and a better philosophy to save humanity. The climate movement has turned its back on the dead tree problem and has become obsessed with money and turning fossil fuels into public enemy number 1 and furthering their social agenda, and forcing wealthy nations to give more money to poor nations, and obtaining more and more research grants, and creating a lucrative market for carbon credits. The climate movement is so focused on other things, so intent on avoiding the reality of billions of dead trees, that they have lost focus on what it would take to heal Earth. As a species, we need to take control of the climate and fix what we broke, and create the symmetry and the balance that humanity needs to survive. We need forests. We need to plant and grow 480 billion tons of new wood. We owe it to Earth. We owe it to ourselves. The entire climate change narrative is a perfect example of a cluster force of arrogance and hubris and deceit and self-dealing. You have the fossil fuels industries and the climate movement lobbing disinformation bombs at each other, each one trying to destroy the other, each one trying to convince the public and the government to take their side and hate the other. For several decades, they have continued to fight their stupid and costly climate war, and all the while the problem of excess carbon dioxide has become worse and worse and worse. Those climate combatants do not care about Earth, nor the people currently living on Earth, nor the future generations of humanity. All they care about are their money, their ideology, their agenda. There has been plenty of room for compromise for several decades. The fossil fuels industries could have admitted from the beginning that excess carbon dioxide is a major problem that needs to be fixed. They could have helped to increase the efficiency of and to decrease the emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. They could have acknowledged that even though fossil fuels are not the primary source of excess carbon dioxide, the emissions from the burning of fossil fuels still contribute to the problem. And they could have planted billions and billions of trees, which would have barely made any noticeable dent in their profits. The climate movement could have admitted from the beginning that it has always been dead trees and not fossil fuels that were the primary cause of excess carbon dioxide. All that money that has been wasted on the climate agenda should have been used in conjunction with the fossil fuels industries to plant trees and to make more efficient use of fossil fuels and to clean up the pollution on Earth in whatever form. Imagine working together to solve the problem rather than fighting each other for decades and wasting mega obscene amounts of money and allowing the problem to become critical. That is the power of compromise. When you work together with the people who would otherwise be your opposition in order to solve a problem for the betterment of humanity. And you have probably noticed that this essay has been much more critical towards the climate scientists and the climate movement, and a little less critical towards the fossil fuels industries, despite both sides being terrible and doing horrible things. This is because there are mitigating factors. I am being an impartial and unbiased judge and passing judgment. At the end of the day, the fossil fuels industries have given us the gift of power. And fossil fuels have made modern medicine, modern living, modern travel, modern technology possible. It would be exceedingly difficult to find any human being whose life has not been made at least a little bit better and a little bit easier by fossil fuels. Whereas, with respect to the climate movement, I cannot find any legitimate mitigating factors. I fail to see any major accomplishment arising from the climate movement, nor do I discern any benefit nor goodness bestowed upon society. I do not think the climate movement was trying to solve any problem. Rather, they were trying to implement their own agenda, trying to convince people to fund more research, trying to be relevant and famous and powerful. The various actions of the climate movement and climate scientists that were committed against trees were callous, cold, wrong, and reprehensible. They have even violated the sacred scientific method. And thus far, they have expressed zero remorse, zero contrition. If anything, this essay has been too kind to the climate movement, considering the drama and trauma and financial burdens they have imposed. Lastly, I'm going to try to put this climate change fiasco into some sort of philosophic perspective. You see, on the one hand, there are people who view Earth as a wild and pristine wilderness, and they see human beings as dirty, nasty, evil invaders who deserve to be punished and sent back to the Dark Ages. They want to preserve and protect what they perceive as the natural state of being on our planet. And they think humanity is unnatural and unnecessary. The foundation of this perspective is self-hatred. This is the root philosophy of the climate movement. On the other hand, there are people who view Earth as a smorgasbord of wealth and opportunity. They think our planet should be used and abused and exploited and destroyed. They are self-centered and selfish, and they do not care about Earth. They feel no moral duty to clean up the mess they make, and they do not care what happens to humanity in the near or distant future. The foundation of this perspective is greed. This is the root philosophy of the fossil fuels industries and the climate deniers. These two philosophies might appear to be diametrically opposed. However, they are both rooted in the Luddite tradition, and they are stopping the machine of human society. Both the self-hatred that propels the climate movement and the greed that propels the fossil fuels industries and the climate deniers will eventually destroy human civilization, and the end result of both philosophies will be human extinction. I am here to propose a better philosophy for the betterment of humanity. We need to view Earth as a garden, a zoological, botanical, agricultural garden. Our job is to control Earth, to grow a better garden, to create a better home for future human beings. In our future, before humanity is sucker punched by the next social movement, before we spend trillions of dollars on specious and distorted crusades, we should remember that the most important things upon which we should focus our efforts are healthcare and fresh food and fresh water for everyone, and creating the most beautiful garden out of Earth. Seriously, the next time someone tells you that we need to spend trillions upon trillions of dollars on something, on anything, the first question you need to ask is this: does every human being on Earth have sufficient healthcare, food, water, and the necessities for living a happy life? Until the answer to that question is in the affirmative, our species needs to focus our resources on what really matters. And in our distant future, to the extent possible, in order to protect humanity, we need to unlock the mysteries of matter, energy, life, time, and distance. We have to stop fighting against each other and start helping each other. We have the brain power to create the most beautiful garden in the universe. We need to start right now. We need to figure out how we are going to transplant our garden to the distant galaxies. There is a lot of work to do. We can begin by planting a few billion trees. Thank you.